Good morning. I wonder if some of you would just like to stand in place for just 15 seconds and stretch so you can stay awake throughout my presentation here. Okay, that's enough. So good morning. It's great to be here. As with everyone else, I want to express my appreciation to Bill Linton and to the wonderful staff at Promega that have together made this incredible event happen. At the outset, I want to acknowledge the collective experience and wisdom of all of us on this incredible frontier where science is encountering the sacred. Most of us know we are mortal and have experienced grief. Many of us have our own treasured memories of forays into intriguing and awe-filled states of human consciousness. Whether they may have been facilitated by the ingestion of substances like psilocybin, whether they seem to occur spontaneously or in the context of meditative practices, sensory isolation or overload, heights of artistic or athletic performance, exceptional sexual experiences, natural childbirth, or physical crises such as cardiac arrest. In all these exceptional states of awareness that Abraham Maslow named peak experiences, is one of my mentors for a wonderful year, we may momentarily have glimpsed the perspective expressed by Teilhard de Chardin. Not that in those sacred moments we were physical beings having spiritual experiences, but rather that in essence we all are spiritual beings who, during the routines of everyday living, are having physical experiences. My own contribution today comes from many years of being with a wonderful variety of fellow human beings as they have experienced mystical and other alternative states of consciousness, triggered by entheogenic substances, as they have sought to express those experiences and as they have tried to integrate those insights into everyday behavior. This has been a profound privilege for me, and I acknowledge each of these persons as one of my teachers. In addition to this cache of research experience, I too have my own personal collection of loves and losses. From the death of my wife, I gained experiential knowledge that had been quite unknown to me when I taught college courses in death and dying. The memory of my dying father comes to mind. He looked at me and said, "Bill, I've never died before. I hope I do it right." I reassured him that he would do just fine, and as far as I could tell, he did. Now, I invite you to accompany me to the dimly lit basement room in the psychiatric clinic of the University of Göttingen in Germany, where my professional identity as a psychedelic researcher was born a mere 49 years ago. At that time, Hans-Karl Leuner, one of the prime researchers in the potentials of psychedelics in psychotherapy, was looking for volunteers for a study of two short-acting derivatives of psilocybin. Two of my friends had participated in his research project. One had experienced himself sitting in the lap of his father, who was killed in World War II, and it was very meaningful to him. Another had described hallucinations of SS men marching in the streets. At that time in my life, as a graduate student in both theology and psychiatry, I viewed my own mind as a laboratory and was busily writing down my dreams most mornings. I called it collecting my phenomenological data. And I often went without breakfast to do it. In retrospect, I suspect breakfast would have done me much more good. At any rate, I had never seen a hallucination, and I thought that regression to childhood might prove instructive, maybe lending new light on my Oedipal dynamics. So I applied to be a volunteer. Screening consisted of an interview in which I was asked about general health and whether I got drunk very often. As I didn't, I was accepted, led to this basement room, just large enough for a little cot and an end table with a window looking out over the hospital garbage cans. And I was given an injection of psilocybin and left alone. This was 1963, and though news of psychedelic drugs and the Harvard controversies were beginning to spread, it had not yet reached me. I affirmed all the faith I could from the piety of my Methodist childhood and prepared to experience the dark conflicts from my unconscious. Instead, to my utter amazement, my field of awareness deepened and expanded until what we today call mystical consciousness prevailed and quietly recognized itself. This consciousness was beyond time and space. It was permeated by love and wisdom. It felt more real, more fundamental than any state of awareness I ever had known. Insofar as there was any imagery to report, it was of exquisitely beautiful abstract lines and patterns, like the script of the Arabic language, or the magnificent symmetrical patterns in the domes of some great mosques. It wasn't as though I was looking at these patterns. Rather, my identity had merged with them, as though I was but one atomic particle in a vast, multidimensional and living grid of energy or web of being. My ego, or everyday personality, appeared to be one infinitesimal part of something infinitely greater and unspeakably magnificent. And when it existed, was very thankful simply to be a part, to witness and participate in this incredible eternal panorama. Now, in the midst of this awesome epiphany, Gerhard Baer, the psychiatric resident who had given me the injection, entered the room with white coat and stethoscope. He asked me to sit up on the edge of the cot and cross my legs. Intently, he hammered on my patellar tendon and scribbled down his findings, while I sat with arms outstretched, feeling what I subsequently called compassion for the limitations of science. I realized he had no cognizance of the potential import of the mystical state in which I had been immersed, or how impossible it was to express that awareness in language. It was not I who had the mystical experience, any more than it was the mystical experience who had me. When I was left alone again, garbage men arrived and emptied the metal cans outside my window. I experienced the sounds as tinkling temple bells. Then, sensing that my consciousness was returning to its normative state, and fearing I might not remember what had occurred, I reached for a sheet of paper on which I wrote, Realität ist. Es ist vielleicht nicht wichtig, was man darüber denkt. Reality is, period. Perhaps it is not important what one thinks about it. When Gerhard returned again, I had but one question. What was that drug you gave me? How do you spell it? Psilocybin. A few days later, still in awe of the experience, I recall looking at what I had written and thinking, well, but of course reality is. Any idiot knows that. Yet I knew I had been groping to express an ontological insight, very deep, very profound, beyond the scope of the word reality as we understand it in everyday consciousness. Shortly after this experience, I met Walter Panky. There he is. Walter had recently finished his classical Good Friday experiment at Harvard and now was on a traveling fellowship to visit centers of psychedelic research in Europe. Together we taught Dr. Leuner all that we were beginning to learn about the importance of set and setting, about the value of being grounded in a human relationship, about the intention to choose to trust in an unconditional manner, about the supportive value of a pleasant environment and the skillful use of music. Soon I found myself serving as a volunteer guide with English-speaking professionals who requested a legal opportunity to experience the effect of a psychedelic drug. Then back in the United States, I found myself assisting in research with psilocybin in Boston in the mid-1960s with Walter and also Richard Katz and Carl Saltzman. Then onward to research in Baltimore at Spring Grove and the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center from 1967 to 1977 with Walter Panky until his death in 71 and with Stan till his departure in 73. And with other colleagues such as Al Kurland, Charles Savage, John Reed, and Richard Jensen. Finally, after a dormant period of about 23 years, our research at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine began. After Bob Jesse from the Council on Spiritual Practices in San Francisco came to Baltimore and introduced Roland Griffiths and myself to one another. We were both here, but we didn't know each other. And subsequent members of our Hopkins team have included Mary Casamano, Matt Johnson, my son, Brian Richards, Catherine McLean, and many others. We have just a fabulous team at Hopkins. So in the context of different protocols over some 22 years of active research, I have had the honor of being with persons with cancer confronting the imminence of death, addicts struggling with dependencies on alcohol and narcotics, persons suffering from anxiety, depression, and various personality disorders, and normal volunteers from many walks of life, including mental health and religious professionals. Almost all of these persons would never have considered taking a psychedelic substance outside of the structure of a legally sanctioned research project. And here is a glimpse of the room at Hopkins where we currently administer psilocybin. Gives you a little feel for how it works. That's actually my son Brian on the couch, and Mary Casamano and myself. Okay, in our research over the years, the definition of mystical consciousness has come to mean something quite precise, not at all something misty or vague. Its definition includes the presence of 6 categories: unity, transcendence of time and space, intuitive knowledge, sacredness, deeply felt positive mood, and ineffability and paradoxicality. So when evidence of these 6 categories can be found in the content analysis of a written description of an alternative state of consciousness or via responses to questionnaire items, then for research purposes we conclude that indeed mystical consciousness has occurred. I will briefly attempt to describe these categories. I think they're relatively familiar to most of you. The transition in consciousness to unity, we understand to occur in 2 ways. Internal unity occurs with closed eyes as the volunteer experiences the gradual expansion of the field of consciousness until the everyday self is claimed to merge with something infinitely greater, often called by such names as the Godhead, the ground of being, or the void. The classic Hindu image for this incredible experience is of the unity of Atman and Brahman, of the drop of water merging with the ocean. External unity, in contrast, occurs with open eyes, as the perceiver and the object of perception are claimed to resonate or prehend one another, as I think Alfred North Whitehead would have said, as if the atomic particles that comprise both the perceiver and the perceived become conscious and intuitively recognize that all is one, that everything is somehow comprised of the same ultimate form of energy. Transcendence of time and space indicates not only that there was no awareness of time and space, but more impressively that this state of consciousness somehow feels outside of time, beyond history, process, cause and effect, evolution. This is the eternal now, the infinite, pure being. In religious language, this is eternity. And according to many reports, immortality appears blatantly obvious. From this perspective, time and space may be viewed as Kantian categories, as ways we experience and organize our perceptions and cognitive processes in everyday existence, but only of relative validity in comparison with the intensity of mystical consciousness. Intuitive knowledge, which William James called the noetic quality, and Walter Stace called objectivity and reality, encompasses claims that mystical consciousness is more than an emotional experience. It also entails recognizing what we may call spiritual truths, such as the immortality of the soul, the interrelatedness of humankind, the absoluteness of beauty, and the primacy of love at the core of being. This knowledge also affirms the experiential validity of mystical consciousness itself, which typically is claimed to have felt more real than awareness in everyday existence. It is often expressed in language of homecoming or recognizing a familiar state of awareness that is felt to have prevailed before birth. Sacredness, sometimes called awesomeness, captures claims of profound humility and respect. As consciousness is expanding into mystical dimensions, some people claim to feel like a creature approaching its creator, or as one receiving unconditional acceptance and love in a stark intensity never before imagined. There also may be an intuitive sense of awe at jewel-like colors in geometrical forms, often described as similar to high Gothic vaulting or Middle Eastern arabesques. Deeply felt positive mood, described with words like love, joy, peace, purity. For some it includes lila, the Sanskrit word for divine play. With mystical consciousness in its memory banks, the everyday personality typically feels that all is well, in spite of suffering, conflict, and death, that all are intrinsic to the human pilgrimage through time. Ineffability and the overlapping term paradoxicality refer to the difficulties encountered when one attempts to express mystical language or mystical consciousness in language. Classical philosophical antinomies or opposites, such as freedom and determinism, the one and the many, the personal and the non-personal, the masculine and the feminine, all tend to be viewed not as either or, but as both and. People claim to have died, yet never felt so alive. They may speak of a void or nothingness that contained all reality. Parmenides, the ancient Greek who wrote of the unchanging one, and Heraclitus, who focused on constant change and flux, both may be seen as expressing insights into the truths intuited in mystical consciousness. Ineffability is often expressed with words akin to the verse in the Tao Te Ching, those who know do not speak, those who speak do not know. The very structure of language, at least at this point in its development, is claimed invariably to distort the truths experienced, and thus attempts at verbal expression may even be viewed as intrinsically profane. The Russian poet Tuchev simply says that when it comes to expressing mystical consciousness, quote, a word that's spoken is a lie, unquote. This dilemma has been likened to the situation of a caveman who has been transported to the future, perhaps to mid-Manhattan, where he sees skyscrapers and subways, airplanes, cell phones, and then he's returned to his cave and his wife says, "Grog, what did you experience?" All he can say is that it was big, loud, amazing. Yet within himself, he may have sensed that there was an intrinsic order and a meaning that people at some future time might be able to decipher and articulate. So, in summary, mystical consciousness refers to a state of mind characterized by unity, transcendence of time and space, intuitive knowledge, sacredness, deeply felt positive mood, ineffability, and paradoxicality. And in illustration, here's an excerpt from the experiential report of a 31-year-old research subject with stage 4 lymphoma, a man married with 2 children. He wrote, "I first went to a place that seemed to completely lack the qualities of this world as we know it. I seemed to transcend time and space, and I lost complete identification with the real world. The experience seemed to me to be as if I was going from this world back to another world before this life had occurred. The actual changing from this life to whatever was before this life seemed to be involved in a very bright silver massive energy with a very strong electrical current. Strangely enough, I felt that I had been in that massive energy at one time before. When I was there, everything seemed to make sense. It was a very beautiful world, one in which love was very much a part. The basic theme that I perceived was that life continues to go on, and we are basically some form of essence from a supreme being, and we are part of that supreme being. I don't have the fear of death that I once had. I am willing to accept the plan of the Creator and go on when it becomes necessary to the next segment of His creation. I have found that everyday living seems to be much more enjoyable. Small things in life that I may have overlooked, I seem to appreciate now. I have a much greater and deeper understanding of other people and a much greater capacity to try to fulfill other people's needs. Overall, I think I am a much more content individual, having had the great opportunity to glimpse for a very short moment the overall thinking of God. of possibly being brought into his confidence for just a brief period, to be reassured that there is a very beautiful, loving, masterful plan in the universe for all of us. Now, a few words about archetypal and visionary experiences, which may be reported at the apex of a psilocybin session that does not culminate in complete mystical consciousness, or may occur just before or after the unitive state. These experiences typically are described in the subject-object dichotomy of perception, insofar as there is a separate sense of the ego who beholds the vision and approaches or interacts with it. This is the realm of mythology as described by Joseph Campbell, not as myths that are not true, but as encounters with symbolic processes that are central to the functioning of our psyches and the heritage of our species and life on Earth. Here, one may encounter gods and goddesses, angels and demons, precious gemstones and metals, awe-inspiring architecture and landscapes, scenes and story or ritual sequences that appear to originate in other civilizations, intricately beautiful objects of art, and the phenomenon of inner light itself. These experiences appear to constitute empirical evidence in support of Jung's concept of the collective unconscious. And as Stan mentioned, it is common for volunteers to experience content that is claimed to be independent of their enculturation. A Christian may encounter Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, or the dancing Shiva, as well as the Christ. A self-proclaimed atheist or agnostic who is capable of being open to new experiences may encounter profound religious imagery from many different spiritual traditions. The word archetype, going back to the Greek philosopher Philo and reclaimed by Jung, designates what might be called the furniture of the unconscious. Living symbols, whether understood to be genetically encoded or spiritually accessed, that simply appear to be part of the human mind. Once such phenomena have been experienced, it is quite easy to understand the matrix out of which various religious concepts may have originated. Indeed, there appear to be heavens and hells within each of us, and they are fascinating and magnificently designed. A little art for here. Okay, onward to the mystical and the interpersonal. William James and other pioneers who have begun to study the psychology of mystical and archetypal experiences have called attention to persisting positive changes in attitudes and behavior, or fruits for life, that often have been reported and observed following these profound states of consciousness. The inspiration and personal meaning of these states often appears unquestionable for those who experience them. Within their own psyches, death often ceases to be feared. There are reports of feeling more at home in the universe. Furthermore, often there are reports of decreased anxiety, depression, interpersonal isolation, and preoccupation with pain. Such benefits appear to occur even when they are not explicitly intended or targeted. One of our participants in our current project with psilocybin in cancer patients at Johns Hopkins applied out of a yearning for spiritual experience alone, even though he had a history of chronic anxiety with nail biting since childhood. Nonetheless, he discovered, quite to his amazement, following his first experience with psilocybin, that his anxiety was essentially gone. In fact, he reported that he found that his fingernails were growing, that he had no nail clippers in the house and had to go out and purchase them. 6 months following this experience, he informed us that the old familiar anxiety had not returned. The healing factor when such impressive findings occur clearly is not a drug effect as such, certainly not one that requires repetition of dosage. Rather, it seems to be the vivid memory of mystical consciousness itself, and perhaps enduring neuroplastic changes that accompanied or followed it that really constitute the healing influence. This is very important because it's not giving psilocybin that helps people. It's the type of experience that occurs when psilocybin is administered wisely and competently with the right dosage in the right situation that brings the positive results. It's so much more than a medication. Okay. One of the most inspiring observations is the manner in which human consciousness often appears to seek integration and the application of transcendental experiences to interpersonal relationships. It's often quipped that it's very easy to love all mankind. You know, loving those fellow human beings with whom you interact with on a daily basis, that's much more challenging. It is also inspiring to observe how cancer patients who participate in psychedelic therapy often become empowered to become therapeutic agents in their family systems. The implications of this observation for preventive medicine are immense, as many mental health disorders either originate with or are exacerbated by personal tragedies and grief work that either is ignored or aborted. To illustrate, you're going to have to use your imagination here. Let me describe the psychedelic experience of a terminal cancer patient who, after traversing through a difficult rocky landscape where she came to terms with her diagnosis and prognosis, arrived at a visionary gate, beyond which she could see roses as far as the eye could see and hear what she called the singing of angels. Within her own mind, just as she was about to go through this visionary gate, she heard the voice of her daughter calling her. She turned around in her experience to find out what she wanted, discovered to her dismay that the session was ending, and initially expressed her frustration by saying, "If I ever see that gate again, I'm going right on through." However, it was in the weeks before her death that she interacted with her daughter and addressed conflicts between them in ways that were profoundly reconciling. After the patient's death, I received a letter from the daughter in which she wrote, "Dear Dr. Richards, I had never watched anyone dying before. Thank you for giving me the chance to say and do so many things for my mother that others like me never had a chance to do for theirs. I'm still grieving for my mother. Maybe I'm grieving and crying for all the wasted times in our lives. I was the black sheep in my family, but in the end, I had a place for my mother to come and stay. We became very good friends in the end. We both asked each other's forgiveness, and we both gave it. Thank you for telling me that the only way to conquer your fears is to face them. I didn't know that. Out of all the sadness and pain, something good came out of it." Another illustration comes from a cancer patient who reported a vision of a magnificent emerald on a velvet pillow, which she approached 4 times. The first time she encountered several of the dynamics in her relationship with her husband and finally felt she had confronted and let go of each of them with a focus on gratitude for their relationship. The second time she approached the elder of her two sons and her ambivalence about his decision to marry a woman with a child from another man, and worked through her difficulty in fully accepting her future daughter-in-law and granddaughter. The third time, she encountered her younger son who had not excelled academically and who also reminded her of her gay brother, and came to a point where she felt she could accept him as he is. It was the fourth time that she approached the visionary emerald, when she felt drawn into the crystalline structure of the gemstone and into mystical consciousness. Yet another classical example of this apparent wisdom within many, if not all, human psyches is the story of the theological student who, while diligently pursuing his graduate studies, was neglecting his wife and children. He took LSD and superimposed on a fireplace saw many veils, which he intuitively interpreted as barriers between himself and God. Slowly, he pulled one veil after the other aside until only one remained. He braced himself for what he expected to be the great experience of seeing the face of God. He dramatically pulled the veil aside and was confronted by a vivid vision of his three children crying for their father. Such processes indicate the entelechy of the interpersonally grounded psyche. Entelechy refers to a meaningful process of unfolding content. What is so amazing is that what unfolds often appears to be wiser and better choreographed than anything the egos of subject and guide could have designed in advance. It appears that the psyche itself, beyond the limits of the everyday personality, often manifests not only wisdom and intelligence, but also love and caring for human relationships. The Jewish existentialist Martin Buber noted this in his emphasis on the I-thou relationship between people and also in the connection with what he called the eternal thou. There's a principle to note here. Though there may be many so-called dimensions of being, awesome and eternal, beyond our limited perception as we live our everyday lives, and though they may be experienced as more real or more fundamental than our state of awareness in everyday existence, still, our egos, our lives and experiences in the veil of Maya seem to have their own significance and reason for being. They appear to constitute an important part of the so-called cosmic design. Perhaps that is why some meditative approaches that would attempt to kill off the ego may be misguided and may generate depression instead of enlightenment. The ego appears to be best transcended not through disrespect or violence, but through caring and unconditional acceptance. Mystical consciousness, when occasioned by entheogens, almost always is claimed to be preceded by the death of the ego and followed by its rebirth. During that sacred non-temporal experience, which measured by clock time can vary from seconds to hours, the heart and lungs of the body continue to function. Though intuitively the indestructibility of consciousness may appear obvious, our rational minds can't help but ask if that awareness would continue to be present when heart and lungs are still, brain activity no longer detectable, and cell walls are collapsing in the process of decomposition. Many of you know the closing of Leo Tolstoy's short story, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, in which the very word death ceases to have meaning. He wrote, "And death? Where is it?" He tried to find his former customary fear of death and could not. Where is death? What is it? There was no fear because there was no death. In the place of death was light. Here is something like, he suddenly said aloud, "What joy!" For him, all this passed in a single instant, and the significance of this instant did not change. It is over, death, he said to himself. It does not exist more. Similarly, the word death comes to mean waking up or transition or homecoming to many persons. Eternity, a world outside of time and cause and effect, has become more than a religious, philosophical, or scientific construct. It is a trusted memory of an experience. Even the wording of the question, "Is there life after death?" seems awkward and inappropriate, as the question itself implies a continuation of consciousness within a temporal sequence. As other presenters have and will mention, we appear to be in the early stages of what Thomas Kuhn called a paradigm shift, a change in the manner in which the majority of people on Earth conceptualize what we call reality. I can think of no better way to illustrate this in reference to the topic at hand than to refer to a poignant scene in Bertolt Brecht's play Galileo, one of my favorites, which many of you may know. In the play, Galileo has been experimenting with a new invention called the telescope, has been making careful observations of the moons of Jupiter, which periodically seem to disappear, and has stumbled upon a new paradigm of reality. At this time in history, every well-educated person knows that the Earth is the center of the universe and that the stars and planets rotate around it in beautiful crystalline spheres. Authorities confirm this way of viewing the world, including the Pope and Aristotle. Now, you must understand that at this point in history, telescopes are very controversial. Young people have been buying them and using them for voyeuristic activities. So, if you are a responsible parent, you would not allow your child to have a telescope. Galileo, however, has used his telescope in a disciplined manner and has glimpsed an incredibly fascinating frontier of new knowledge. Unlike Bruno, who made the same claim a few years ago and was burned at the stake for it, Galileo has data to support his new view of reality. He invites the authorities of his day, a philosopher, a theologian, and a mathematician, things have changed, to look through his telescope and personally confirm his discovery. In Brecht's play, they stand beside Galileo's telescope, referencing the scholarly writings of their day, but they refuse to look through it, arguing that if by chance they thought they saw what Galileo was claiming, they know that it would only be a hallucination. They are certain of their understanding of reality. Galileo is forced to recant, to apologize for his heresies, and he lives out his days under house arrest. However, he knows within himself that the truth he has glimpsed will stand on its own. and someday will be integrated into the knowledge of future inhabitants of the earth. Today, Ptolemaic astronomy is long forgotten. Doctoral theses no longer are written on careful observations of the irregular epicycles of particular celestial bodies within crystalline spheres. I wonder how many people got their Ph.D.s on those theses. Now our mental models and vocabularies are being stretched by new data about matter and mind, coming from quantum physics, molecular biology, genetics, and studies of the phenomenology of human consciousness. The equivalent of Galileo's telescope for consciousness studies clearly is the sacred molecule of a substance such as psilocybin, dimethyltryptamine, or lysergic acid diethylamide. Different skeleton keys that enable us to peer into the mysteries of our own being. As with the telescope or microscope, it is obvious that these incredibly valuable and powerful tools require skillful use. To illustrate some of the points I have made and pave the way for reflection on cultural taboos, I've dug into the archives, and I'm going to show you brief excerpts, only about 8 minutes, from a documentary made of the treatment of a cancer patient with psychedelic therapy. This was aired by CBS as part of their 60 Minutes series in January of 1977. The research protocol being implemented was a comparative study of psilocybin and dipropyltryptamine, even though the program was called LSD. You'll also note that Dan Rather and I both have aged some in the intervening years.
This is an artist's concept of what it's like to be under a psychedelic drug, based on descriptions from people who have been there. Like everyone else, we were horrified to learn recently that the Army and the CIA were using LSD on unwitting human guinea pigs, people who didn't know they had been given LSD until they experienced frightening and sometimes fatal symptoms. So we set out to learn more about psychedelic drugs, and the trail led us to the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center near Baltimore. It is not the first time CBS News had been there. Some years ago, we went there to observe neurotics and alcoholics being treated with LSD. What we found this time surprised us.
Basically, I feel pretty good.
This man is not a neurotic or an alcoholic. He is a terminal cancer patient. His name is Kenneth Peele. He is only 39 years old. He is married. That's his wife, Jo, at his side. He is the father of 2 teenage sons. Until 2 years ago, he was a robust Baltimore welder.
I have this hard driving pain. It's almost impossible to sleep.
This is his last in a series of therapy sessions preparing him for psychedelic drugs. Drugs that will open his mind, make him better able to cope with the physical pain that racks his body and the mental anguish that afflicts his mind as he wrestles with the prospect of dying young, of leaving a wife and 2 children behind. Doctors here believe he must express those fears and anxieties to himself and to his family. They believe that psychedelic drugs, combined with psychotherapy, make that expression possible.
Stay with it every time you talk. Just let the music carry you. What we're really doing is trying to help dying people to live. Okay? And in a sense, that includes all of us and all people. The major goal is to enhance the quality of life.
The drug begins to take effect within minutes. The trip will last more than 4 hours. In sharp contrast to what does happen to a person on an uncharted trip on psychedelic drugs, you will see no wild reaction here. That's because Kenneth Peele is not taking this trip alone, because he has been thoroughly prepared for what to expect, because he knows his therapist will be at his side throughout the day. So you will see in Kenneth Peele little outward difference. The difference is inside.
Tremendous light.
tremendous sound, a burning, until we finally had a finished crystal. Things are very delicate here.
In what way delicate?
Like webs. People walk on spider webs. I'm one of them.
Look at your rose.
I never took time to look at a rose that close.
As the drug begins to wear off, Mr. Pew is encouraged to explore his feelings by looking at photographs of himself and his family.
That was a graduation picture from high school.
If you look at, take a good look into your own eyes there if you can. How do you feel about that young fella now?
Seems like so long ago he's disappeared. Doesn't seem like he's around anymore.
Mr. Peele, as you have said yourself, you're going to die, as we all are. Why go through this treatment?
Well, there are several reasons. One, it's taught me to appreciate life a little more. It stimulated me, I think, to see things that I didn't see before. It's kind of taught me to kind of stop and smell the roses. I think I feel more relaxed. It's helped me to cope with the pain that I have. I have pain constantly.
Have you found it easier to communicate that to your wife and to other members of your family since the treatment, or
Yes,
has there been much change?
We have become much more open. My sons have accepted the fact that maybe I'll get well and maybe I won't. There's no guarantee that the drug treatment or the chemotherapy and the operations that were done will be successful. There's no guarantee.
When we found out that Ken had cancer, and we had decided that we would be very open with each other and nothing would be hid from each other. But in the last, I'd say 6 months, we were both trying to protect each other. We kept telling each other, oh, everything's going to be all right. And since the drug treatment, we've been able to look at, there's two sides of this situation that, well, maybe we still have hope, but that Ken may die.
The boys I'm always concerned about. I think that's why they don't enter into these dreams. I protect them, keep them back. Keep that from happening.
Feel some concerns if they can make it in life.
Maybe that's some of it.
Sure like to be around for a goodly number of years yet to give them the guidance you have to offer.
That's what I'm hoping for. That I have the years left to give them the guidance that they need. And I know that Joe will carry on where I leave off.
There is considerable debate among researchers in other places about whether, and if so, how much, psychedelic drugs help people such as Kenneth Peele. He, however, has no doubt.
Now I can't say how my death will be. I don't know if it'll be slow or fast. Will I be in a coma or awake? I will have to accept death as it is.
Many people, perhaps most, contemplate death, at least some of the time, as a terror, if nothing else, a terror of the unknown. I don't get a sense that you feel that way about it.
No, I don't have this terror about death. I feel it's part of living. It's something that we have to face, all of us.
Thank you, Ken. This documentary was viewed by several million people in the United States and Canada. On the day afterwards, I expected that the telephone would ring all day with inquiries about how one might participate in our wonderful ongoing research. Instead, it rang only once in late afternoon, when a nursing student from Pennsylvania called to ask what the music playing in the background was. One of the conundrums with which I have lived is trying to comprehend why an intervention that appears so meaningful, potent, beneficial, should meet with such strong resistance. I have tended to conclude that the reasons are many, one building upon the other. Notably, our fear of death itself, including our fears of ultimate dependency and of honesty in the midst of life experiences we cannot control. Our fears of inner conflicts and of profound religious or spiritual experiences. Our ignorance and distorted understandings about psychedelic drugs. The reluctance of referring physicians to recommend an intervention that may be controversial and their lack of time adequately to explain it. The weariness of many cancer patients themselves who may be hesitant to invest precious time in a treatment that does not promise a cure for the disease. And limited scientific data and dissemination of research findings. Fortunately, the climate these days is a little better than a few decades ago, but we still have a long ways to go. Okay, following the lead of Søren Kierkegaard, I've decided to close with my own concluding unscientific postscript. For whatever it may be worth, my personal understanding is that consciousness is incredibly and unspeakably vast and dynamically creative. It strikes me as reasonable that there could be many different forms of immortality. Perhaps some of us reincarnate some of the time. Perhaps even those who wish for nothingness after death might experience that until it becomes too boring. My own intuitions about the nature of the eternal center around concepts of constant evolution and change with a sense of divine playfulness, the Hindu lila, all permeated by love and energy beyond anything our limited intellects can begin to imagine. It is of interest that most persons who experience entheogen-facilitated mystical consciousness appear to place little importance on personal immortality, that is, the survival of the individual personality after death. Typically, they express a conviction that universal qualities such as truth, beauty, and love indeed are eternal, and that is sufficient. Nonetheless, let it be noted that there are many different alternate states of human consciousness. One of our volunteers at Hopkins did spend most of the time during the action of psilocybin in what for him was a very convincing conversation with his deceased brother. I would not try to judge whether his report indicated a tuning into a dimension of consciousness where individual souls may be encountered, or whether this person had the gifts of a creative novelist. What I do know is that the experience was profoundly meaningful and healing for him. Similarly, volunteers often experience sequences of images from other times and other cultures, which some would interpret as memories of prior lifetimes, while others would tend to classify the experiences as universal or symbolic dramas of the creative psyche. Whatever they are, they're incredibly fascinating and detailed and emotionally potent. Many of us would like to believe that life is more than the journey between birth and the death of our physical organisms. Yet some genuinely express hope that consciousness ceases at death. They've had enough and expect to be quite disappointed if they have to contend with immortality. They would readily inquire whether mystical consciousness could be the delusion of a dying brain, desperately fighting for its survival and denying its finitude. Or perhaps mystical experiences could be pathologized with labels such as regression to infantile states of mind, cognitive impairment, or schizoid withdrawal from reality. We have arrived at that frontier where the growing edge of true science meets the mystery of the unknown, at least unknown insofar as it can be expressed through our present cognitive and verbal capacities. Here, each person is on his or her own, choosing the philosophical, religious, or spiritual framework in and through which one orients oneself and expresses one's being in the world. Here, faith takes over, either as belief in something or belief in nothing. Once again, we are aware that it is not in the usual purview of science and the scientific method to prove or disprove the reality of God. As His Holiness the Dalai Lama has observed, quote, "The view that all mental processes are necessarily physical processes is a metaphysical assumption, not a scientific fact," unquote. He also reminds us of his conclusion that current neuroscience really does not have any explanation for consciousness itself. Perhaps Karl Jasper's dictum that man is fundamentally more than he knows or ever can know of himself still resonates as we ponder the mysteries of our own being. Although my personal preference is to conceptualize this more, not as a ghost in a machine, but as a deeper mystery in and through the dancing forces of energy we call matter. I know that paradoxicality is encountered in quantum physics as well as in mystical consciousness, and that there could be truth to be found in both perspectives. You may know Teilhard de Chardin's description of his own personal spontaneous mystical experience is a poem called "The Spiritual Power of Matter." And it's a fascinating perspective. What would civilization look like if most of us no longer feared death? What if life were understood to include states of consciousness both expressed in the context of physical organisms and in energetic fields quite independent of them? What if the everyday consciousness of most people was sufficiently enlightened or awake to include awareness of both the temporal and the eternal dimensions of a greater reality? It sometimes seems as though we tend to be afraid of not fearing death, anxious that if death is not intrinsically evil and to be avoided whenever possible, that we might all somehow become more prone to suicide or homicide. Some might tend to magnify these fears by recalling images of tragedies of the past, such as the multiple deaths at the compound in Guyana left by Jim Jones, or the harm inflicted by suicide bombers, or the carnage in battlefields throughout history. Yet the evidence from psychedelic research provides little support for such fears. People who lose their fear of death typically appear to live more fully, to respect the lives of others, and to treasure the time that remains in interaction with family and friends. Some cancer patients, acutely terminal, may choose to forego final experimental procedures that have little probability of offering extended duration of qualitative life. But as long as pain can be managed and meaningful communication is possible, they appear eager to continue to do whatever is required to keep their bodies functioning. In closing, I recall one of the first cancer patients who I guided through psychedelic therapy, a 50-year-old Jewish woman with 2 children in early adolescence. She had sent her 2 children off to summer camps without telling them of her diagnosis, hoping to be dead before they returned. She had not told her elderly mother of her illness, for fear it would kill her. Her relationships with her husband and mother-in-law were at best perfunctory. Her concept of death was that of a light bulb going out. If immortality made any sense, it was through her good deeds as they manifested in the lives of her children and someday her children's children. She had read Sidney Cohen's book, The Beyond Within, which described how some cancer patients experience Van Gogh-like visual transformations during the action of LSD. So she had several valuable paintings and sculptures moved into her private hospital room. The content of her psychedelic experience, however, consisted of reliving many years of chronic depression, which she summarized as, quote, an emotional bath, unquote, what many would call a bad trip. She had no interest in looking at the art in her room. Whether the session included a glimpse of mystical consciousness or not, I could not determine. The only positive experience she would describe was a scene as she was returning to normative consciousness of bouncing balls in the streets of New York City, reminding her of an experience she shared with her sister there. Whatever the phenomenology of her experience was, it resolved her depression. She called her children home from their summer camps one at a time, and personally prepared them for her death. She did the same with her mother and was relieved to discover that her mother rose to the occasion and did not die. She expressed anger at her husband and mother-in-law and at her surgeon, and their relationships came alive in new ways. She enjoyed giving away selected pieces of jewelry to her friends. On the day prior to her death, just as she was on the verge of becoming comatose, I visited her. She expressed appreciation for the benefit she had experienced, and also a sense of awe at the potential import of the research we were conducting. I asked her if she still thought death would be like a light bulb going out. She smiled, looked me in the eye, and said, "Yes." Then she paused and added, "But I'm willing to be surprised." I close with our websites, both in Baltimore and New York, and ask you to keep us in mind for appropriate referrals. Thank you very much.